Well, I hope that you're doing well. I hope that your week has been good so far. If you're not well, we certainly want to be praying for you. So if we don't know it, please let us know so we can be praying for you by name. We want to let you know that we love you. And if we can do anything at all for you, we just ask that you would ask us. We're finally starting the book of Romans here online. Tonight. We actually started it Sunday afternoon in person. But when we think about the book of Romans, it doesn't take us long in reading the book to get the feel that, get the magisterial feel, we might say, that the book is important. It's big. It's authoritative, we might say. And this is something that people have noticed throughout the history of interpretation when they have looked at the book of Romans. In fact, every one of us, I shouldn't say every one of us, most people are familiar with Martin Luther. Maybe we're not as familiar with his theology, but the book of Romans really influenced his theology. How he thought about the law, how he thought about sin, how he thought about faith, how he thought about the gospel, etc. In fact, this is a quote from Martin Luther. This epistle is really, notice this, the chief part of the New Testament and is truly the purest gospel. It is worthy not only that every Christian should know it word for word by heart, but also that he should occupy himself with it every day as the daily bread of the soul. Of course, if you're not familiar with Martin Luther, this is the German theologian who was very influential during the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. But notice what Martin Luther had to say. It's almost as if he could have selected books from the New Testament and put them in order of importance. The book of Romans is very important to him. He not only thinks that every Christian should have it memorized, but that every Christian should study it every day, right? Well, John Calvin, we're probably more familiar with his theology maybe than we are with Martin Luther's. Nevertheless, he thought the book of Romans to be of great importance as well. He said, if we had gained a true understanding of this epistle, if we have gained a true understanding of this epistle, we have an open door to all the most profound treasures of Scripture. So notice that he thinks it sort of opens doors for us, right? That we are more blessed, our life is more enriched spiritually if we understand the book of Romans. Of course, this is the French theologian living during the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Before we begin in the book of Romans, we ought to treat it like we do every book before we start. We ought to try to put all preconceived ideas, beliefs aside, and try to read the book as if we were reading it afresh. Now, it is impossible to put all our previous beliefs aside, to not let other ideas influence how we interpret the book, but we ought to try, okay? Right? We want the text to speak for itself. We don't want to read into the text. We want to draw meaning out. Okay, so what about the authorship of the book of Romans? Well, it's not really debated, even among scholars. There's a pretty general consensus that Paul is the author of the book of Romans. So why even discuss this topic? Why even bring this up? Well, because of what Romans chapter 16 in verse 22, it has a pretty interesting detail. Let me flip there. Romans 16:22. It says, I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord. Now, hold on. I thought we said Paul was the one that wrote the letter. Well, we said Paul was the author of the letter, but now we have this guy in Romans chapter 16 and verse 22 named Tertius who says, I wrote this letter. So what in the world is that all about? Well, apparently Paul had an amanuensis. Now, what is an amanuensis? Is an amanuensis an author? Is an amanuensis, what is it? Well, generally, an amanuensis we could think of as a secretary. That is to say, Paul communicated something to him, and this person that was trained would write down what Paul wanted him to write down. Now, if Tertius is Paul's amanuensis, we have to ask the question, how much freedom did Tertius have in composing the letter? That is to say, did Paul just give him general ideas, general themes for the book, and we can attribute all the specific features of the book of Romans to Tertius, but not to Paul? Or did Paul sort of give him more of an idea of what the book, how the book was supposed to be composed, gave him more than just general themes, did give him specific features, but Tertius, in listening to this, kind of wrote it down in summary fashion and then went and, put the letter together? Or are we to think that it's more word for word, that, he was writing while Paul was talking? Well, that's really where we get into this. I definitely don't think it's the first one. If you read other letters of Paul, the book of Romans is very Paul-like. Okay. Either way, here's what's agreed on. The amanuensis is not the author. Paul is the author. Everything Paul wanted to communicate is in the book. I really want to say more about that, but if we're not able to have a discussion in person, I don't want something I say to be misconstrued or misinterpreted. I don't want that, so we'll just drop that. All right, what about the dating of the book of Romans? Well, it seems that the book of Romans was written somewhere between 55 and 58 AD. Now, where do we get that from? How is it even possible to obtain a date for the book of Romans? Well, luckily we have the book of Acts, right? And the book of Acts highlights Paul's missionary journeys. And we can take the contents, fortunately, from the book of Romans and the contents from the book of Acts and sort of compare and sort of come up with a roundabout date. What's interesting is when we look in Romans chapter 15, we get some valuable information. Specifically, when we look in verses 19 through 23, it says, by the power of signs and wonders, this is not what I wanted. Verse 22 of Romans chapter 15. This is the reason why I have so often been hindered from coming to you. But now, since I no longer have any room for work in these regions, and since I have worked long for many years to come to you, I have longed. I hope to see you in I can't read today. I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain and to help on my journey there by you once I have enjoyed your company for a while. At present, however, I am going to Jerusalem, bringing aids to the saints from Macedonia and Achaia, have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints in Jerusalem. So notice Paul really gives us in his itinerary here. Notice he says, number one, I'm about to make a journey and I hope that I can come see you. Now, why does Paul want to go to Rome, the church at Rome? Because Paul has never been to the church at Rome. So he desires to see his brothers and sisters at Rome. He also says, I'm really interested in ministering to the West. Paul's sort of been hanging out in the East, and he now wants to do the same in the West. But before he does that, notice he says, I got to go to Jerusalem, okay, because I got to drop off the collection that I'm going to get from Macedonia and Achaia. Okay, so that's a lot of different places, but fortunately we can go to the book of Acts and we can kind of see, where Paul is at here. Acts chapter 19 in verse 10. Quiz yourself real quick. Where was Paul in Acts chapter 19 and verse 10? You could just ask yourself, where was he in Acts chapter 19? Yeah, if you said Ephesus, you would be right. This is what verse 10 says. This continued for 2 years, so that all the residents of Asia heard the word of the Lord, both Jews and Greeks. Okay, so Paul at least spent 2 years in Ephesus. So where did this desire, where was he when he had this desire to go to Rome and to go to Spain and to drop off the collection to the saints in Jerusalem? Where was he? Well, he was in Ephesus. How do we know that? Well, we keep reading here in the book of Acts. Go down to verses 21 through 22, or at least it seems his desire seemed to have, sort of crystallized while he was in Ephesus. Now, after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and to go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. And having sent into Macedonia 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. That sounds strikingly familiar, right? What we read here in the book of Acts to what we've already read in the book of Romans in chapter 15. Paul wants to go to Rome, but before he goes to Rome, he's got to go to Jerusalem because he's got to take the collection that was collected in Macedonia, in Achaia, to the poor saints in Jerusalem. Now, I know that's a mouthful, and what in the world? Okay, this is where we sort of get a date. Now, an idea for a date. Now, where was Paul when he wrote the book of Romans? Well, remember, his intention to go to Rome sort of crystallized while he was in Ephesus. Where can we pinpoint? If you were looking at a map, you kind of have Macedonia, and this is a terrible map, but Achaia. And then what about like right in here? Like you have Macedonia, you have Achaia. What about, can you see where my ring finger and my pointer finger match up here? Right about in that area, Corinth, right? It's a pretty traditional view that Paul wrote the book of Romans for Corinth. Now, from Corinth, not for Corinth, from Corinth. Now, for good reason, because we have some internal evidence in the text, I think, that supports that view. Notice Romans chapter 16, 1 and 2. We get introduced to a person. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church at Cenchrea, that you may welcome her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints, and help her in whatever she may need from you, for she has been a patron of many and of myself as well. Well, notice this sister in the church, her name is Phoebe, and Phoebe is from where? Phoebe is from Cenchrea. Guess where what's near Cenchrea? Corinth. If you said Corinth, you're right. Cenchrea was actually one of the port cities of Corinth. So Phoebe is coming to the church at Rome. Okay, very possible she's the one carrying this letter to the Christians at Rome. But we have even more. Romans chapter 16 in verse 23. This is what we read. Gaius, who is host to me and to the whole church, greets you. Okay, so we're introduced to this guy, Gaius, or Gaius, however you really want to say that. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 in verse 14, we're introduced to a couple of people. Paul says, I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and, what's that? Gaius. Yeah, right? Well, that's not all. We're introduced to another guy in Romans chapter 16, right after we're introduced to Gaius, Erastus, the city treasurer and so Erastus is the city treasurer. Okay, what about Erastus? 2 Timothy chapter 2, 2 Timothy chapter 4, 2 Timothy chapter 4, a lot of verses switching around here. Looking in verse 20 is where I'm going to be. Erastus remained at Corinth. Okay, so now we can place this guy Erastus and we can put him in Corinth at least for some time. Okay, things are starting to add up. Do you see how people may come to the conclusion that Paul wrote the book of Romans while he was in Corinth during the time that's described in Acts chapter 20? Verses 2 through 3. Let's go ahead and read that. I know we haven't looked at that. So Acts 20 in verses 2 through 3. After the uproar ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, he said farewell and departed for Macedonia. When he had gone through those regions and had given them much encouragement, he came to Greece. There he spent 3 months, and when a plot was made against him by the Jews, as he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. So it seems that Paul more than likely wrote the book of Romans while he was in Corinth. Okay. Why did he write the book of Romans? Well, if you look up the numbers, right, of, we're thinking about the Jewish population in Rome about this time. I'm sorry, my dog is barking. We look at the population. We're looking at somewhere around 15 to 60,000 Jews at this time. Now we know Paul didn't establish the church, so who established the church? Well, it seems more than likely that when you go to Acts chapter 2, and we're reading about the day of Pentecost, you read about these visitors that actually came from Rome. Well, it seems like these visitors that came from Rome went back to Rome and set up a church in Rome, and these would have been Jewish Christians. Now, if you're reading the book of Romans, you know that there's Jewish issues discussed, and there's also Gentile issues as well. Well, where did the Gentiles come from? Well, there's this Edict of Claudius. Now, you don't have to be all that familiar with the Edict of Claudius to know what it's about, because Acts sort of tells us what it's about. Acts chapter 18, in verse 2, the latter half of the verse, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome, right? So Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome for a period of time. So who took over the church? Well, apparently the church didn't die, right? We know that the church is alive at this point in time because Paul desires to go see them. And now there's Jews and Gentiles. So what happened to the church? Well, it seems to have been taken over by Gentiles while the Jews were gone. And after Claudius died and the Jews were actually able to come back to Rome, what did they find? A church that was once predominantly Jewish is now predominantly made up of Gentiles. Well, can you see where problems might arise and where Paul might have to offer some wisdom? That's a lot. That's all we're going to talk about tonight. We'll pick up in the book of Romans next week. I can't wait to see everybody Sunday. God bless.